தஞ்சாவூர் சமையல மண்மனம் மாறாம வாஞ்சையோட வழங்குது வைத்தாஸ் கஃபே. கும்பகோணம், கடப்பா, சிதம்பரம், கொஸ்து, அசோகா அல்வான்னு விதவிதமான உணவுகள்ல அறுசுவை படைக்கிற 60 ஆண்டு பாரம்பரியம் கொண்ட வைத்தாஸ் கஃபேக்கு டி நகர், அடையார், ஐயப்பந்தாங்கல் பகுதிகளில் கிளைகள் இருக்கு. ஸ்விக்கி மற்றும் ஜொமோட்டோ வழியா உங்க வீட்டுக்கே வந்து விருந்து படைக்கிறோம். விசேஷங்களுக்கும் செஞ்சு கொடுக்கிறோம். வாயிரும் மனசும் நிறைய வைத்தாஸ் கஃபே.
On the 10th of March of this year, the cruel hand of fate took away a flower that was yet to bloom fully, took away the fragrance of the garden of your house. Yet we must live on, and I am proud of you that you have institutionalized his memory in this fashion. Thank you very much. We all have to be part of this journey. For a young man who was in the 4th year of his law, ready to start practicing in court and share with others the vision, his ideas of the Constitution as it would have unfolded before his eyes. But that was not to be. We are here to, as you rightly said, to commemorate his life for the last 20 years. And I consider it a privilege to start and to inaugurate the first lecture of the foundation, Rakesh Law Foundation, the endowment of which is in the Roja Muthiar Library. The topic is this the democracy envisaged by the founders of our Constitution? Very few people really quite understand what a Constitution means. What is a Constitution? It's the architecture, the framework of various organs of state which collaborate with each other and are in conflict with each other from time to time for the welfare of the people. That's what a constitution is. Within that process, there are checks and balances which institutions which are set under the constitution ensure that the vision of our forefathers is kept intact as the Constitution works itself. The word democracy has many meanings, but in the context of our Constitution, our particular Constitution, democracy means, and it is set out in the various provisions of the Constitution, to ensure that the institutions of the state work for the welfare of the people, and that the welfare of the people is foremost in the minds of those who run the government. And in that process, every voice needs to be heard. Every cry of pain needs to be recognized. And every achievement needs to be applauded. That's what true democracy means. Are we a true democracy? It's a question that all of us nowadays ask ourselves. And I feel somewhat saddened to say that we are not. Our democracy starts with an election and ends with its result. Beyond that, there is very little that I see today in the functioning of those institutions that are central to our democracy. The Constitution, if you look at have a panoramic view of the Constitution, you will see that the Constitution talks about the functioning of various pillars of government, or pillars of the state, in a sense. You have the judiciary that is obligated under the Constitution to protect us, our fundamental rights. You have Parliament that enacts laws consistent with the Constitution, supposed to be consistent with the Constitution. You have a government that implements laws. You have a public service commission that ensures that the bureaucracy in the country works within the norms set out under the conditions of service. You have an election commission that ensures that the elections are free and fair. And you have various other organs of the state, other institutions of the state that allow democracy to flourish. These institutions include universities, include research institutions, include the institution of the governor. And so the Constitution really tells you about how these various institutions are constituted and how they must function. But that's nothing to do with the vision of our forefathers. For the vision of our forefathers is encapsulated in Part 4 of the Constitution. That's the vision. If we achieve that vision, we will actually be a truly democratic nation. And I want to read to you Article 37 of the Constitution, which is Part 4 of the Constitution, which says the following, and I'll read it to you. It says, the provisions contained in this part, that is Part 4, shall not be enforceable by any court, but the principles therein laid down are nevertheless fundamental, mark the words, fundamental in the governance of the country. And it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. In other words, even though Part 4 cannot be implemented through a court process, you cannot issue a mandamus in court for the implementation of Part 4, yet Article 37 says, nevertheless, what is set out here, the principles set out here, are fundamental in the governance of the country, and it shall be the duty of the state to apply these principles in making laws. In other words, when Parliament enacts law, it must enact it in the context of the principles set out in this part. That's fundamental in the governance of the country. Now, what is the first principle that is set out? And that's in Article 38. It says, state to ensure a social order for the promotion of the welfare of the people. The state shall strive to promote the welfare of the people by securing and protecting as effectively as it may a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political shall inform all institutions of national life. Now let's just pause here. What does this mean? It means that if Parliament is to enact laws, the objective of the law must be that it must secure and protect a social order in which justice, social, economic, and political must inform all institutions of public life. Now let us test that. Therefore, the Constitution and the forefathers envisaged social justice, economic justice, and political justice. So when Parliament makes laws, it must be tested on the touchstone. Does it in any way ensure the protection of social justice, economic justice, and political justice? And I'm afraid that just the opposite is happening in India. Just the opposite. Laws perpetrate social injustice. They perpetrate economic injustice. And they perpetrate political injustice. And courts of law have never tested the laws that are enacted in this country on the fundamentals of Article 38 of the Constitution, of the Constitution, because Article 37 says only such laws should be made that secure social, economic, and political justice. Now let's test. I think the most draconian law in this country is the 10th schedule of the Constitution. The most draconian practice in this country is the practice of the whip in Parliament. It destroys the very concept of political justice. Imagine I am a member of Parliament, Ilango is a member of Parliament. He represents a constituency, where in Rajya Sabha he represents a state, I represent another state. My dear friend Chidambaram, now in Rajya Sabha, was in Lok Sabha, so was I, represents a particular constituency. Now he, as a matter of law and in the context of political justice, has the right to speak up for his constituency, to articulate the vision of those constituents who have elected him, or her, as the case may be. But in Parliament you sit and the party tells you, this is how you're going to vote on this bill. You have no voice. You cannot articulate what your constituents want. Is that political justice? When a bill is passed, you may have several misgivings. But you have to pass the bill because the party issues the whip. You cannot voice your opinion in Parliament. Is that political justice? What is happening in Parliament today? What is happening in states today? There's a 10th schedule. If you vote against the whip, you will be disqualified. Is that political justice? You may not agree with the bill. If you voluntarily give up membership of the party, you will lose your seat, you will be disqualified. What is happening today? Elections are held. Governments are formed. Governments are destroyed. 10 people, 20 people are bought over. They violate the whip. The established government falls. Those very people, because if the established government falls, assembly is dissolved, elections are held, those very people who have violated the whip, made the government fall, are elected and become ministers. Is that political justice? En masse resignations take place. 20 people resign from one party because they are promised a ticket, a ministership, a membership of a board, a chairmanship of a board. They resign. They resign from the party. Government becomes a minority. Elections take place. They get into Parliament, or they get into the assembly. New government is formed. They become ministers. Is that political justice? These laws are handmaids of political injustice. It's the very destruction of the concept of political justice envisaged in Article 38 of the Constitution. Why is it that in countries, parliamentary democracies like the UK and the US, there is no such thing as a whip? Therefore, presidents in the United States actually, Republican president has to actually go to Democratic members and seek their support for a bill which the Republicans, part of the Republicans oppose. Similarly in Great Britain. I can understand a whip issued when their budget is going to be passed, because in the absence of a budget, the government will fall. I can understand that. I can understand that on a major policy decision, a whip is issued. I can understand that if there's a no confidence motion against the government, you have to support the government to make sure that your government maintains power, is secure. But I can't understand the very concept of a whip in respect of legislations, ordinary legislations, say the PMLA, the Prevention of Money Laundering Act, UAPA, Unlawful Activities Prevention Act. why should members of parliament not be allowed to raise their concerns about these acts? This is the very antithesis of political justice. And so, what happens in the process is a majority government, because of its majority, passes these laws. They are the most draconian laws in the country. And we've seen what's happening around this country, how these laws are misused against political opponents, whether it's in Maharashtra or it's any other state. Suddenly you find the enforcement directorate reaching out against somebody who's spoken against the government. Under the UAPA, what is happening? How many terrorists have been imprisoned under the UAPA? It's mostly students, academics, those who dissent against the government, people who protest against the government. Why is that happening? That's happening because these laws are passed by majorities, absolute majorities. There is no chance to dissent because of the whip. There is no public debate. Is that what the constitution makers wanted? And this is despite a judgment, a constitution bench judgment in the Kyoto Holohan case, which says that the whip should only be used at the time of a no confidence motion and at the time of the budget being passed. Despite the declaration of the law, parties issue whips, we have to obey whips, and this is despite the fact that under Article 105 of the Constitution, members of Parliament have freedom of speech in Parliament. Economic justice. Let's talk of economic justice. 1% of the people in this country, 1%, account for 22% of the national income of this country. 1%. 10% account for 57% of the national income of this country. This is the World Inequality Report. There's an Oxfam inequality report. 10% have amassed 45% of the national wealth. And 6% of the population shares 50% of the national wealth of this country. 142 Indians, just 142 Indians, have a collective wealth of 53 lakh crores. It's 1.5 times the budget. Just 142 Indians. And what is the directive principles of state? What does Article 38 say? Economic justice. Is that anything to do with economic justice? The wealth of 10 richest can actually fund school and higher education. Just the wealth of 10 richest for 25 years. 1% wealth tax on the 98 billionaires in this country will fund Ayushman Bharat for more than 7 years. That's the state of the economy. The Pew Research Institute of 2021 says a year ago, 60 million earned less than rupees $2 a day. 60 million. And in the year 2021, this number increased to 134 million. So poverty is increasing and the rich are getting richer. And the laws in this country are helping the rich to get richer. The Azim Premji Institute says 23 crore people were pushed into poverty in 2020. 23 crore people. Rural poverty increased by 15% and urban poverty increased by 20%. In the Global Hunger Index of 2021, India is at 101 out of 116 countries. Lower than Nepal at 76, Bangladesh at 76, and Pakistan at 93. There's another very, very strange provision in our Constitution. I've never understood it. That's Article 164, capital 1B, which says that if a person is disqualified under the 10th schedule, I'm sorry I'm coming back to that, but I thought I should mention it. If a person is disqualified under the 10th schedule, then his disqualification shall remain only till he fights the next election. So in other words, if he violates the whip, makes a government fall, and the next election takes place, he becomes a minister. And the Constitution says that's okay. So there is no concept of political justice in the context of our laws. There is no concept of economic justice in the functioning of government. And laws are used to not prosecute, but persecute people. And we're seeing it every day. Just this morning, there was a news item that said that somebody in Agra who eloped with a girl, his house was burnt because she belonged to another religion. Between 2009 to 2019, 91% of hate crimes took place between 2014 and 2019. And minorities, the hate crimes against minorities represented 73% of all those hate crimes. And of the 73%, Muslims were victims in 61%. How do we explain that? There's another provision in the Constitution, I think it's Article 48. Let me read it. It's a very interesting provision. It says, the state shall endeavor to organize agriculture and animal husbandry on modern and scientific lines, and shall in particular take steps for preserving and improving the breeds and prohibiting the slaughter of cows and calves and other milch and draft cattle. In other words, the Constitution prohibits the slaughter of cows who give milk, and the slaughter of calves and the slaughter of draft cattle. Draft cattle are cattle who plow the fields. The farmer plows the fields with draft cattle. And you have a law which is against cow slaughter. The law against cow slaughter is contrary to Article 48 of the Constitution, because a law against cow slaughter is antithetical to the article. Why? Because it's only milch cattle that cannot be slaughtered. And yet, a political party uses this for political advantage, knowing full well that this is contrary to the Constitution. For a farmer, a cow that does not give milk is of no use. So he sells it. But selling that cow is a crime because you'll get lynched. And if the cow strays, then it's a traffic hazard. And it, in fact, the sale of that cow boosts the economy in a different way, because the skin is used, and the Dalits use it, for trade. Goods are manufactured and they are sold. Now that whole economy is destroyed because of a law which is inconsistent, and yet a particular political party uses it to political advantage. How do you justify it? The result is you have cow shelters. Now cows die in cow shelters. And the subsidy that is given for each cow is 30 rupees a day, which is not enough to feed anybody, any cow. So they die. They are put to no use. Thousands and lakhs of people have lost their trade and lost their business. And this very article, which prohibits not slaughtering of cows, but only milch cows, is used for politics. How do you justify it? A state where the business community owns mainstream media and funds the political party, which gives advertisements to mainstream media and runs a campaign to ensure that a single narrative reaches the people of this country. You cannot explain that. Constitutionally, it's unacceptable. Well, big business houses big business houses give money to the government through electoral bonds. And when money is given to the government through electoral bonds, big business houses need favors, quid pro quo. These very houses own mainstream television channels. So they run the agenda of the government on those television channels. The alternative narrative is not allowed to be shown. So there is a vicious conspiracy by the corporate sector, the government, the political party in power, and the funding of that political party through electoral bonds. And the court doesn't want to hear the matter. How does the court justify that? How can the court sit silently in this act of political injustice, which has subverted the Constitution of India, contrary to the very concept of Article 37 and 38 of the Constitution? How does anybody justify it? The court chooses not to listen to these matters, not to hear these matters. I know for a fact that when it comes to disqualification of members of the opposition in a state assembly, that matter is never heard. It lingers on for years and years and years. And suddenly when something happens in Rajasthan with another political party, which is in government, the matter is heard in the Supreme Court the next day or a few days thereafter. And then it is to be heard day to day. How does a court justify that? So if the court is silent and the people are not heard and the corporate sector funds a political party and the government funds mainstream media controlled by the corporate sector, how is that democracy? What has that got to do with the welfare of the people, which is the heart, the conscience of 37 of the article, of Article 37 of the Constitution? How do you justify that? And is democracy only about having an election? The Election Commission is supposed to ensure that elections are fair and free. In the context of what I have told you, elections are unfree because of electoral bonds. And therefore they can't be fair. And how does then the court not hear such matters? For years. Demonetization happened on the 8th of November 2016, where in 2022 the matter is still not heard. How does an institution like the court justify that? So if the Election Commission is compromised, the finance minister is not consulted during demonetization, how do we call ourselves a democracy? The only democracy we have, if we can call it democracy, is to ensure that an election takes place and to make sure that a particular party wins. That's the meaning of democracy in India, as I understand it today. And that also through a machine. I vote for a particular candidate and the machine counts my vote. I think that's an anachronism. How can I allow my vote to be counted by a machine? In Germany, the use of the machine, like all other countries in the world, has been rejected. But in Germany, there's a philosophical reason why it was rejected. And it's part of the speeches in Parliament. They said, we've gone through a process of a monster who ruled our country, a dictator. Whether the machine can be manipulated or not is not the issue. If it can be manipulated, it may be manipulated, then the person who manipulates it will always win an election. And that will lead to another dictatorship. We cannot allow that. I have a fundamental issue with the machine counting my vote. And it's not for me to prove that it's manipulated or not. That's not my job. That's the job of the Election Commission. And the Election Commission, when we raise issues before the Election Commission, they put up a wall and say, look, you tell us how people manipulate. I can't tell you how people manipulate. If sitting in the United States of America, you can, or through Pegasus, you can find out what's happening in my home, then what's the machine which costs 15,000 rupees? So the fact of the matter is that there is silence all around. Nobody speaks. In Russia, there are protests against Putin. In Pakistan, the Supreme Court of Pakistan does what it should do. And here, we are all silent. We choose not to speak. We choose not to protest. And the institutions are collaborators in this farce of democracy. They collaborate with government, with the party. Just a few houses, some of them from Tamil Nadu, some outside of Tamil Nadu as well, choose to raise the voice. I can go on and on. Look at what's happening with Digital India. 24% of schools in India had internet connection during the pandemic. Of the poorest people in India, just about 12%, 6 to 12% have any form of computers, any form of Wi-Fi. In schools, by and large in schools, a very, very small percentage have working computers. And we talk about Digital India. The fiber optic network was supposed to connect 250,000 gram panchayats. They've not yet even connected 150,000. And now the Prime Minister has made a statement that I'll connect all villages. Well, I don't know when that'll be connected. By that time, we'll all be disconnected. How is that social justice? That's not social justice. 37% of the children born in this country are stunted. 30% in urban areas and more in rural areas. Women are anemic. Children become anemic. The expenditure on healthcare by the government is 1% of GDP. They said they'd make it, healthcare expenditure should be 2.5% of GDP in the years to come. Said by 2025. It's not going to happen. The United States spends 16% of GDP on healthcare. UK and other countries spend 10% of GDP in healthcare. Is that social justice? We're talking about justice, social, economic and political. It is the perpetration of injustice, social injustice, economic injustice, political injustice. Incomes. The household incomes, and I think that 24%, rather, about 800 million people earn less than 10,000 rupees a month in this country. 67% of the households in this country earn less than 10,000 rupees a month, as opposed to the number of billionaires that are produced every year in this country. So what has happened is that those who are constitutionally obliged to listen don't listen, and those who have the freedom to speak have stopped speaking. So for if you don't speak and those in power don't listen, there will be no dialogue. And if there is no dialogue, there can't be democracy. That's the state of affairs in India. I can go on and on about other provisions of the Constitution, but I think this is not what our forefathers envisaged. The fault lies with us, for we choose not to stand up. It's time for India to stand up. It's time for you and I to stand up. For if we don't, democracy will perish. We will not let that happen. Thank you very much.